Okay, so let's jump into page one and we'll kind of walk through the interface a little bit and kind of talk about what some of the buttons do. And then we'll get into the remediation of this page. So when I arrive in the remediation page, there's kind of a lot going on. And if this is the first time you've seen this, which I think it is for the majority of you, it can be a little bit intimidating. So there's a lot of buttons here. So I'll walk through what these buttons do. But the first thing that I notice when I look here at the remediation page are these yellow rectangles that are kind of covering up the content. These yellow rectangles are what we refer to as reading zones. And reading zones are essentially the same thing as tags. So if you're coming from an Adobe Acrobat background, which I assume that you've had at least some experience or exposure to that sort of concept of tagging PDFs, these reading zones really act the same way. These are what's going to establish the tag structure when you export the document back to a PDF. So we're here to use these reading zones to organize the content to make sure that everything on this page is read in a logical way that's going to be compatible with assistive technology, primarily like a screen reader. So we need to make changes to the various reading zones on the page if there's changes that are required. So we'll get into kind of what some of those changes are in just a moment. Before we start making edits and changes to this page, I'm just going to run through kind of the interface and what some of the buttons do. Now, on the left-hand side, you have your kind of main workspace, and this is where you'll do like, you know, the majority of your manipulation. There are two separate tabs. One is for the page tab. So the page tab allows you to make changes to the document at the page level. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have a document that you have some zones on the page, but you're not really impressed with what you've got. Maybe the existing tag structure just looks like a big, you know, tangled mess, or maybe the initial detection that Equidox has given you is just not quite right. You have this little slider here called the zone detector, where if you move this back and forth, you'll notice how Equidox kind of redetects the granularity of the zones on the page. So as you bring it more to the left, it kind of gets more zoomed in. As you bring it back to the right, it kind of zooms out a bit more. So you just have different options as a starting point. It's a good way of like, it's a good place to start if you don't like the initial detection level that you've been given, or if you don't like the existing tag structure, you can kind of reset things with the zone detector. What's nice about using the zone detector from the page tab is that you can apply it to all pages. Now, this is handy if you have a document that is maybe a bit longer and it's kind of got a templatized formatting. So you're using the same fonts and color schemes and like general layout structures throughout the document. If you apply it to all pages, it will set that detection level for you across all pages. And then in theory, you won't need to revisit this slider. If you have an outlier page or two, you can always adjust it. But it should do the, you know, correctly set the sensitivity for the majority of pages if it's that type of document where it's kind of consistent. The zone detection slider is also available up here, just so you're aware. So we just recently put out a new user interface, and part of that was to make the interface more accessible to people that use keyboard to navigate. So we've put a lot of the commonly used buttons up across the top. So the sensitivity slider is kind of duplicated in both locations. So it's always there for kind of easy access. Down below, you have the reading order option. And again, that's also duplicated up at the top. So with the reading order, Equidox, the default assumption, it's going to be a one-column reading order. And all that means is that we're going to set the reading order left to right, top to bottom. So as Equidox scans the page, it's going to find every single reading zone, and wherever it finds a new reading zone, it's going to place that next in the sequence. So that can always be adjusted, though. You have 4 different column options. So this is if you need to reorder things at the page level. You can also reorder things in different ways, like for individual zones or even a multi-select of zones. You can do kind of like group zones together to reorder them. We'll get into that later. But in general, you know, your reading order for the full page, you can either choose 1, 2, 3, or 4 columns, and that should, in theory, give you a really good starting point depending on the layout of the page. So by default, it will be 1 column, but again, you can apply it to all pages. If you have, let's say, a 3-column article that's 20 pages long, If you choose 3 columns, you can then hit apply to all pages, and then Equidox will set it for you for all of the different pages in the document. Now, over on the right-hand side, in collapsed, it's really just a thumbnail of the pages in the document. So if you need to like scroll around and jump to a different page, you can always you can find that. But if I typically just leave that collapsed. Now, if I click on a specific zone, you'll notice that the zones tab is now populated. So there's the page tab and then there's the zones tab. And when I clicked on that zone, a bunch of new menu items just appeared right here. Now, these menu items are duplicated, so they're also available on the left-hand side, much like these buttons are available on the page tab. But part of, again, the interface redesign was to put the commonly used features up at that top menu because it's easier to access through a keyboard. But these are kind of duplicates. So as a mouse user, in general, what I do is I just hit this toggle switch to eliminate that second layer of the menu, because to me, I just visually like the way that it looks better this way. And it also just gives you some additional vertical space on your screen. So if you're using like a wide monitor, I like to have as much, vertical space as I possibly can. It's all a preference though, so you can toggle that on and off with this little toggle switch. Now, when you click on a specific zone, you can interact with all of the properties of it. Right now, all of the zones on the page are set to text zones by default because this is all just text as far as a machine is concerned. There was no tag structure to begin with. So we're going to go through some processes to kind of clean this up and make sure that all of this is set up properly for a screen reader user. Now, the buttons up at the top here, just to quickly run through them, there is an undo and a redo button. If you have an undoable action, then you can hit the undo button and it'll like reset things for you to whatever it was before. The redo button will like revert back. So it's kind of like you can go in both directions. So if you smash the undo button 10 times and you only meant to hit it 9 times, you can just hit the forward button when that populates. I don't really use these too often, but they are like nice to have and not need rather than need and not have. So don't rely too exclusively on them, but they're there if you need them. This little circle with the half moon, this is not like a critical function for the purposes of training today, but the little green flags in the upper left and right hand corner of each zone, that's called the zone info. It's just the type of zone you're dealing with and then also the reading order of the zone. You can turn those on and off depending on your preference. I, in general, leave them both on, but sometimes you're dealing with a really like tightly spaced page, and the little green flags can just become like an eyesore. If you've got 150 zones on a single page, it can be a lot to look at. So you can turn them off if you'd like. There is a save button, so if you're halfway through a page and you want to save your progress, you can. You also save when you toggle between pages. So on the left-hand side over here, there are arrows to take you from page to page, and it will prompt you to save your work as you go. So being a browser-based application, even if your Google Chrome does like a forced update on you or your laptop battery dies, you're never going to lose your progress. You're saving at the page level. So no more of like Adobe Acrobat crashing and 4 hours of work just being like thrown away. Which happens all the time. This check mark right here, this is a nice tool, especially when you're collaborating on larger documents with other people. When you hit this check mark, it marks the page as validated. So it just indicates to other users that this page is done. So if you're back at the main document list, you can see that, okay, 1 of 2 pages are complete here. And there's actually a toggle switch. If you flick it to the right, it'll only show you the pages that are yet to be complete. So again, if you're collaborating and working together and you're like maybe leapfrogging around in the document where you're doing 20 pages in the morning and then someone else logs in and they do 17 pages and then you have time in the afternoon to do 30 more, instead of having to like try to figure out where the last person left off, you can always be aware of that by using the check mark here. So you can see exactly where people left off in the process. There are zoom in and zoom out buttons, which I was just pressing. So those are pretty self-explanatory. It's just all a preference on what you like to look at, depending on the page. So you can zoom in and zoom out. There is this lowercase I icon. So this is a menu of keyboard shortcuts. Don't worry about memorizing these, but this is just a menu if you'd like to look at them. Now, Again, this is more speaking to the accessibility of the application itself. But as a mouse user, I can still use those shortcuts to kind of pick up the pace. It's just less mouse movement, less clicking around, less drop-down menus that you have to deal with, that type of thing. So they will become second nature after a while. There's probably about a dozen or so that I use just without even thinking about it. And I'll let you know when I'm using them today during the training. There's also this X that will close out of the page and bring you back to the document detail page. So pretty self-explanatory. If you close out, it'll bring you back to where we started. Okay, and then the button that I skipped over here, it's the most important one up here. It's this preview button. Now, when you press this preview button, it's going to open up an HTML preview of the page that you're currently working on. So this HTML preview is just a simple linear rendering of how this page is going to be read if you were to stop working and export the document right now. If you've looked at the tag structures in Adobe Acrobat, you know how complicated it can get. It's very technical, very tedious. You have to have a lot of training and sort of like, prerequisite skills to be able to interpret it. But HTML is very simple. It's just what you see is what you get. So this is a reflection of the reading order. If we have headings, if we have tables, if we have lists, if we have hyperlinks, all of these different elements are going to populate in our HTML preview. So essentially what you're doing as a remediator is to make sure that your HTML structure sort of matches up with the structure of the PDF and how you would visually read this document if you were going through it. So you just want to build that equivalent experience for a blind person that's using a screen reader who isn't visually able to see the reading order of the page, or they're not able to understand that there's a table there, that type of thing. You need to make sure that you're setting up the structures on your from your PDF through that HTML preview. Now, in terms of making changes to this,